everybody, Ryan, Choices Not Chances. I just wanted to kind of briefly do a lead in and a little bit of a a disclaimer regarding this episode. This is just Miss Jo Munisteri, and a wealth of knowledge, bringing knowledge of her experiences with USAID in Afghanistan, USAID in Kiev and Ukraine, and some of the different projects that she's been on. And she's going to be completely transparent as far as her experiences go. I just want everybody to know that this is her experience. This is me providing a platform to allow transparent thought and dialogue flow through somebody to other people, to give you an idea of some different ways and different places you can look and do your research to ensure that you're finding credible information. And I'll leave that on you to decide what's credible and what's not. But I do want to bring this special episode to you. Miss Jo Munisteri was on episode 83. And so if you haven't gotten episode 83 digested, please either before or after go back and learn about Jo's life or upbringing. It'll explain a lot of her credentials and where she ends up going on behalf of we the people and on behalf of the Constitution. And that's what I'm interested in, is full transparency. And I gave my life thus far, my whole entire adult life, to the Constitution and to the people of the United States of America. And when I start finding out nefarious things that are happening, all it makes me want to do is find every, proclaimed either self or by others, experts in the field who have real on-the-ground experience dealing with these agencies and these programs and these initiatives, and let them speak for themselves in a transparent way, in a way in which they don't, hinder or jeopardize national security, but in a way in which they can talk about the things that they've done in the past and the hand-to-glove relationships that they've seen. And I want you to, take it in, digest it. Jo, thanks for coming on. Thanks for again giving me some of your time and your knowledge and expertise in the Middle East and USAID and these relationships that you've had across the globe.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, absolutely. So I figure if you just want to kind of give a little bit of a rundown for the listening audience. We've talked about some of this stuff offline, but if you just give a rundown to the listening audience of kind of where you've been, as far as Afghanistan, as far as Ukraine, if we're going to focus kind of on those two topics as far as USAID goes, and just let the audience know, your side and your personal experiences and credentials leading up.
I think for some people it's important to know that I graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. I did my graduate work at Massey University in New Zealand. I also have a diploma in traditional Chinese medicine. I have many professional development courses I've completed, including with the Institute of War and Peace. And I also trained with the U.S. Army in a special program, the DAC program, Department of Army Civilians. I'm a certified combat analyst and social scientist. I have worked overseas. I'm still a contractor for a specialist program with the Department of State that I have worked for since 2008. And I have worked as a contractor for USAID for IREX. Many people don't know IREX. It's called International Research and Exchange Board, does education programs and other quote-unquote humanitarian work. I was selected as the first of two people going back in Ukraine in 2015. Another was a former Navy SEAL, and we worked for Peace Corps response. And I've also worked as a military contractor and for many ministries of education in a number of countries.
Okay, yeah, that's good enough for me as far as credentials go, and we'll kind of work through some of those things. Now, if you can just break down, I don't want to get too much into the last episode and dive too far into your past or too far into the personal side of things, but just as a preface to this conversation, when you went to Georgetown and when you started getting affiliated and working with some of these organizations, what was it that drove you to do that?
I grew up in a family that international work was presented to me from an early age. My father worked all over the world as a civil engineer. My grandmother was a physicist, and then in Italy with Enrico Fermi, and then was a high school teacher in science and languages. Many of my family are and were in all branches of the military except for the Coast Guard, in World War II, in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, and some are still serving, both law enforcement and in the military. So service was very important to me, and originally I wanted to be a human rights commissioner.
Okay. All right. Right on. That's a wealth of family service, and it seems fitting if you had international dealings with your families and you grew up that way. Someone maybe more comfortable or more driven to do that abroad than others that maybe didn't have that experience. That's pretty dope. What did you think growing up overseas? And was that just your normal? Did you ever feel like it was something that you were missing from home or something that you didn't want to do?
I was born in 1953, so we didn't have all the social media and we didn't watch very much television, so there wasn't that much of a contrast with other people. My father worked in India, he worked in Iran, he worked in Pakistan, he worked in China, he worked in many South American countries. We would have people come, and on a social occasion, our neighborhoods were multicultural in many places that we lived. So we had people over for dinner, or we would go over to their houses. It wasn't that unusual, I suppose. If you're growing up in that situation, you don't really think about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Check. Okay, well, let's if you don't mind, let's jump into USAID Afghanistan and start there. And the things I want to know. First of all, I don't want to know anything or air anything, as I'm sure you wouldn't, that would affect national security or affect people that are still working. So I don't want that at all. But I do want to get as transparent as a look at what you did and what they do as we can. My interest is the American people and the Constitution and my family to remain and stay free. And I understand we have to do some stuff for that. I understand that. I also understand some things are being, grossly taken advantage of. So, as best you can, without saying something you're not supposed to or I'm not supposed to hear, can you kind of walk me through what this looks like as far as your experiences go?
Yes. I was first acquainted with USAID, which stands for United States Agency for International Development. But as Michael Benz so accurately pointed out, by having the word AID as an acronym, some people think it means aid. That, along with the agency that used to be existing, I think it stopped in 1999, was the U.S. Information Agency, which was responsible for putting out media, especially behind the Iron Curtain in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I, of course, had learned about this when I was at Georgetown. Both Peace Corps and USAID were developed at the same time in 1961. Originally, it was part of the State Department. People are hollering now it's going to go back to the State Department. That was the original aim, was to be part of the State Department.
Mm-hmm.
In 2008, when I first had programs through the Center for Intercultural Education and Development, a partnership with Georgetown University, Department of State has many of these partnerships, hands in glove. It's expanded, I would say, unfortunately, that a lot of these university hand in glove relationships now also are with Soros organization,
Mm-hmm.
which has OSIN, the Open Society University Network, of which I worked with until 2022. So in 2008, I first went to Armenia. USAID had done some worthwhile projects in Armenia. I was a contractor for IREX there, and that's when I was first introduced firsthand to some of their training division and some of the projects that were hand in glove with the State Department and USAID all worked together.
Mm-hmm.
I worked directly as a contractor for, now I think people need to understand, both the State Department and USAID, they have their own departments in Washington, D.C., and their own offices in many countries. There's 196 countries. It's been hard to document, but the most accurate by Michael Benz says every country, but the one I saw was 155 countries have had some sort of contact through USAID. That's considerable. The trouble is that it's often done under another cover, you'll say. For example, they will subcontract out their original contract. That's how most of the contracts that I worked with were done, especially in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Ukraine. And so what happens is I'll give a direct example that I worked for them directly. You will have a USAID project for education in Afghanistan. It was a $791.1 million, almost $1 billion. It was the second time this same contract. The first one was for about $500 million 2 years before. This was for another one on top of that, $791 million, so over $1 billion over 3 years. But it wasn't under the auspices of USAID per se. It was given to a no-bid contract. Under the Obama administration, quite a few no-bid contracts were given through USAID. No bid means there was no competition and really no accountability afterwards either. So this contracting company was called Checky and Company. It has been absorbed into an even larger company now. I think this happened 2 or 3 years ago, Dexis, D-E-X-I-S. I believe Michael Bennis talks a lot about Dexis too. So what happens is the USAID personnel will have often one of the parts of the U.S. consulate or embassy in a country, but then they subcontract out to a combination of U.S. citizens that go over as contractors, like I and my partner, Lisa Akbari, who did Army training together. She had originally been working there, and she asked me if I would join the team for this very large contract, because she knew of my skills. We had worked together before. And then local nationals. And they will give a budget that will include salaries that U.S. nationals with a certain amount of experience, education, credentials, and so forth would get. And the budget will also include transport, accommodation. In there, lots of ways to divert the money are included that often are not accounted for. I'll give you an example. So they will say, and I also, I'll just mention this, I just realized, my barracks mate at HKIA, I did work in Afghanistan from 2014 to 2017, and my barracks mate on HKIA in 2016, 2017, who was the highest CAT interpreter, top secret clearances we both had, and she also was an interpreter for people like John McCain and many generals. She had worked for USAID as a contractor as well in Pakistan, so we discussed the ways, different strategies that are used to divert the money that should have gone to humanitarian programs and don't. So it's not just my experience, I know. But in this case, what would happen is they would put in for, let's just say, a salary of $10,000 a month salary for the contractor, a U.S. contractor, and then they'll put in money for the accommodation, local, national, and they'll put in money for security as per U.S. standards, which I think the lowest rate at that time for somebody like Triple Canopy Gatekeeper was probably $300 a day, maybe more. But they don't hire U.S. security. They put in names of them, but we never had any U.S. security.
You mean they just absolved the money?
Well, they also did it with our salaries, because our salaries in this particular contract were supposed to go up after 89 days in country. And also we were going through the Christmas holidays. That was part of the lure for going over there in a difficult time. But what they wouldn't tell you, and they would do it the last minute, is, the morning of the 89th day, you go into work and they say, oh, you have to go to the airport. And you go to the airport and get a ticket to go back to the States. And then they say, finish your report in America, even if you haven't finished doing the actual interpretations on the ground there. But do they actually tell USAID that they've done this? I'm not talking that this is necessarily USAID's problem, but these contracting agencies do it, and they know that they can still get that money. It's a significant amount of money if you put everything together. Same with the transport. So, and then a lot of things are done, a lot of exchanges are done in cash. In one program I worked with, supposedly for girls, and I was the director for a short time outside of Kabul. Well, we're actually in Kabul, and then some of the areas outside, including Jalalabad. There would be cash deliveries. I was supposed to count the cash, so I did it, and Lisa helped me a couple of times. And it was a minimum of $60,000 in cash, U.S. cash, every week. And that,
and where does that cash? Where's that cash's destination?
Well, that was just delivered to a local Afghan national, and we never saw it again. And this was done under the guise of the girls' program that never existed. So there's dummy companies formed in those countries, dummy transport companies, dummy accommodation. There's lots of ways that the money can be channeled to other groups. Now I'll talk about this particular project, education textbook project. And it ended up being, the team ended up, after being whittled down, to be, at the last few weeks, just me and all Afghan nationals. My teammate, Lisa Maria Akbari, I won't go into it here, I talk about it in the book, was assassinated while we were working there. She was assassinated on the same night that 6 Americans were assassinated outside of Bagram, so that was 7 Americans within a 24-hour period. And by the way, almost all of them, including Lisa, were reporting to OSI, Office of Special Investigations. So
now, what can I, if you don't mind, and I understand if you can't say, what did they find? What were they working on? What was going to be in these reports that made it?
All right, I'll say from my personal. All right. The way a lot of these projects work is we're called in to supposedly assess the feasibility of the project, do a monitoring and evaluation, an estimation of the implementation and time, and just say, is it going to be feasible or not? Theoretically, that money hasn't been approved yet, $791 million on my program. What I found out when I got there, and what Lisa and I and some other local Afghan nationals found out, is that many of these, for example, in the textbooks, all these textbooks that had been ordered, they hadn't come from Afghanistan for some reason. They had gone through Pakistan, and the glue wasn't the glue that was supposed to be used, so the books fell apart. And a lot of these containers that were coming with the books, on the top, when we opened them up, there would be some books, and on the bottom of the time it was just rubbish or newspapers or something to fill the containers. The trucks that were supposed to be going to transport had actually been given to or extorted from terrorist groups, including the Taliban and the Haqqani networks. I mean, I can go on, I do describe some in the book, but I personally know that I was brought in, we went to the U.S. Embassy and USAID for a number of meetings, and I said, no, I do not approve this program. This is corrupt. This money should not be going to this. You just had a program similar, the same, almost the exact same outcomes were at that time, there was evidence that it wasn't going to, and that was $550 million. Now you're going to have another one for $791 million. I'll just jump ahead to say I found in a number of these situations, the programs are designed not to be successful. I'll say this again. They are designed not to be successful. Why? Because if they're successful, then the money doesn't keep going to the administrators in these projects. And if so they always find a way that the outcomes are not met, so they have to continue the program and they have to get more money for the program. It's quite a scam. So I would not sign off on this. In fact, I said the opposite, and I gave lots of evidence and documents to show, and photographs of the places these books were supposed to be stored, where the trucks were supposed to be that weren't there. I was in the field every day, and I was told by the contracting agency, you can't do that. And when I got back to the States, I was told to reconsider, and I was given lots of phone calls were made to me, and people were shouting at me, you can't do that, we've already told them they have the money. I said, you already told them they have the money before we've even done the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
That's wrong. Not only that, the Taliban were extorting teachers, they were killing teachers, they were killing the students, they were totally against this project. This was endangering Afghan local, especially girls and women. All sorts of tactics I described in my Small Wars Journal series on jihadi generations.
Mm-hmm.
One specifically on the tactics used against girls and girls' schools. So I would not sign off on this. And our names are supposed to be scrubbed when they actually go to the Afghan ministry. This was going right to President Ghani at the time. It's such a big project. And later on, I describe it in my newest book, on the chapter on Malta, because I wanted to find out what had happened. The next time I'm in Afghanistan, I get a call from somebody saying this program report is on Ghani's desk, President Ghani's desk. I read it, it's very salutary. I agree with you, but you really can't, we want you to change what you've written or retract what you've written. This is after Lisa was assassinated. I said, first of all, how did you get my phone number? I had just changed my phone number in Kabul 48 hours before, and I was team lead at NKC in support of the 82nd. It was a very serious security job. And that really concerned me, how somebody got my new phone number right away.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also knew that USAID is supposed to scrub our names and supposed to scrub all our local national assets. There is a list, but we don't usually give them that list. And if we do, they're supposed to scrub them. They're not supposed to be on the report going to the Afghan ministries or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I called my USAID contact, who had been transferred to a South American country, but I got in touch with her and I said, did you put our names on there? Did you put my name? Somebody has my name from that report. And she said, no, I would never do that. I believed her. There are earnest people that work in these agencies.
Mm-hmm. And
she was concerned too. That just gives you a little idea about how some of this happens.
Mm-hmm.
I had my arm twisted. I had probably more happened because of that report, but I would not sign off on that money in good conscience for that particular program. They just got somebody else to do it later.
Yeah. Now, is there ever coercion or bribery outside of them just reprimanding you or telling you can't do that? Is there any kind of offered money payouts to make these contracts go through in your experience?
Yes, in my direct experience, both Lisa and I, and Shala and I also talked about this too. What happens is, and this is why I mean there's cooperation between Department of State, USAID, close cooperation in ways people may not think about. For example, there's something called SIV, Special Immigrant Visas, which are highly valued in countries where people need to flee, or they've, there are good reasons for it. If they've been working and helping us, then they may need to get out. But they, certainly I'd say since 2012, maybe even before, but certainly I knew since 2014, a lot of them were sold SIVs under the table, which means you had a contact in the embassy or consulate who would pass this through, but they didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart.
Mm-hmm.
At least 10 years ago, the going rate was between 10 and 15,000 per person. I'm sure it got higher, especially as the time came towards 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And there would also be a cut from, I'll give an example, for a Czechie company that I worked for. Almost all the Afghan local men, and I know at least two of the women that were working for us, after Lisa's assassination, they all got SIVs, and I don't know if they're still living in Virginia, but they were all brought to Virginia.
And paid. Now that money goes to the state?
No, that's under the table.
Yeah, but who's charging it? Who's collecting it?
Well, there shouldn't be any money except for a basic application fee, which is probably less than $500.
Shouldn't be, but you just said the going rate was 10 to 15 grand.
That was the street. I know that some of the street prices in Pakistan and Afghanistan, because I've had to deal with that at certain times. A way of doing business in some of these places is, as somebody tried to rationalize it, just like we'd have to pay for a permit in some places.
Mm-hmm.
It's their donation. In fact, in order to get extracted from Pakistan, when I was there, my local national family had to pay a donation in order to get me a certain stamp that we needed so I could get out of the country quickly. So the SIVs, special immigrant visas, and depending on the consulate and embassy and who's working there, they'll put that application, let's say, at the top of the pile. And you can imagine how big the pile was in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah. I dealt with that a little bit trying to get one of my Terps out. And he said, like, at some point when the first one got photocopied, it got emailed and mass sent to everybody out there that wanted to get out. And then they had to kind of wait on state and the Marines and everybody at the gate to try to sift through what's real, what's not, whose name's real, who's not, because everybody had the same ticket to get out of there. And that got,
Ways like
obviously
that.
sloppy, yeah.
You also have to, sometimes in order to get to a place, for example, and to able to get to the storage facilities to find out about what happened to the trucks or what happened to the containers, you have to pay a fee and a protection fee. That's just part of being able to function in some of these countries, especially during war.
Sure. Now, did you ever have privatized security like Blackwater, Triple Canopy, or any of those fellas attached or securing you, or that was all just facade? Like as far as the money.
This particular contract that I'm talking about in 2015, 2016, we were told before we went that we would have security, and it was a U.S. company. We assumed it was going to be. I always had U.S. Security, of course, working on U.S. and NATO bases, but even the American University of Afghanistan, that wasn't American security. At least that was a British former SAS.
Yeah.
But that security, and they were attacked twice. American hostages were taken. No, we had South African and Croatian, and we were not allowed to carry weapons. None of the programs I was at and in the universities were we allowed to carry weapons. So you're really at the mercy of whoever is driving you. And it was local national drivers that maybe got $9 a day. Could easily be turned, and some were turned. Yeah, that situation is very precarious for people working in the humanitarian sector in general.
Gotcha. Okay, we can transition now if you want to talk a bit about Ukraine and the things that first of all, the things that you've done there, and maybe the programs that you've seen, kind of some of the same stuff go on. But specifically from your writing, there's a lot about trafficking of human beings, and whether that be for labor, whether that be for sex or pornography, whether that be for, one of your papers suggests that there's, a heavy dose of organ donation, or trafficking people for that, or in your article I read, cleaning up the battlefields, a lot of these soldiers just kind of going away. Can we kind of get into some of that, but also talk about the USAID or NGO side of things in Ukraine?
Yes, I just want to add one aspect about Afghanistan, if I might.
Yes, ma'am.
To help people explain why this money goes to the wrong people. It's not just it goes to bribes for other U.S. people there or local nationals. Is especially in education programs, what happens is the adversarial groups, whether it's Haqqani Network or it's folks from Tajikistan as well as Afghanistan or Taliban or ISIS-K, they know about these programs too, through their own networks, and they know about how much money is coming through as well. And so they will extort those local nationals, teachers, I know specifically, or principals in schools, or people who are going to store those trucks that we bought for them, and they will go directly to them, threaten their families, threaten them, extort a certain amount of the salaries that were supposed to go to the teachers, or a certain amount of the money that was supposed to go to the materials. They'll get it. They'll take the materials. In this case, I worked directly. In this case, they actually took the books and some of the other materials, stole them essentially, and then resold them, what was supposed to be given for free, resold them in markets to make money. Yeah. So there's lots of ways that the money goes the wrong places, and not only the wrong places, goes to people who are adversarial to us, who are dangerous, who threaten the people who really want to do work in their own countries, especially for female teachers in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So shall we go to Ukraine now? I'm just going to have a sip of water.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, okay, so real quick before Ukraine, what would you say if you were to rough estimate percentage-wise of USAID dollars that go into these programs gets extorted?
Yes.
And I'm not talking about going back to our administration only. I'm talking about just like the example you just gave. Sometimes maybe it goes to bad corrupt individuals in our own country. Sometimes bad and corrupt individuals in the other country. What's the percentage of what we're giving in millions and billions of dollars that doesn't make it to go for what it's for?
There's an article that came out on the Daily Clout just today, well, yesterday, by Joshua Stallman, and in addition to Michael Benz and Whitney Webb and a few of the other investigative journalists that I respect, Caroline Glick for the Middle East as well. It's called The Pattern Beneath, and it goes along with what most others are saying. It is less than 10% that actually reaches the people or the programs.
That's sickening. All in the guise of aid. Okay. All right, let's do Ukraine.
Ukraine was an interesting situation because after I worked on the second program in Afghanistan, and sort of vowed I wasn't going to go back to Afghanistan, at the beginning of 2015, this is where there was a situation with a quote-unquote girls' school where they were trafficking the girls through the Serena Hotel, for those of you who know Afghanistan or live in Afghanistan, meeting them young, very young, under 16-year-old girls and a few boys, to American politicians and local politicians and military people. Terrible situation. So I didn't want to go back to Afghanistan, and I'd always wanted to work for Peace Corps. I was very idealistic about Peace Corps before I actually worked for them. I was of the era that grew up with Kennedy, Shriver, with Martin Luther King, with doing what you can. Ask not what your country does for you, but what you can do for your country. And so somebody brought up about Ukraine. They were looking for somebody who had experience in medical universities, and I had already worked at the Yerevan State Medical University in Armenia. I had worked in the technical and scientific universities in Siberia, Russia, through that's a whole other story that's in my book, through a State Department Georgetown program. And this was a short-term, it's supposed to be a short-term project of only 6 months, and I thought, well, this is a good experience. It looks like a conscionable program, and it gives me time to think and maybe reshift my career at that point. My son and his father had already been killed at this point, died on K2 in 2013, and I wanted to do some more humanitarian work. I feel like that was my calling, still is my calling. So I applied. I mean, I'm on a lot of different forums, you know, email lists, through State Department, through Center for Intercultural Education, through HR for contracting people.
Mm-hmm.
So I got an email about they were going to, all the Peace Corps programs from Ukraine had been disbanded because of the ongoing, at that point already, we could see a civil war. This was 2015, just after Maidan, and everybody had been evacuated out. But they were going to bring back a larger program in Ukraine. This was Victoria Nuland days. And they were going to have over 300, I think it got up to 400 Peace Corps volunteers, but they had, for the first time ever, a new program called Peace Corps Response, which was emphasized people who already had at least 10 years experience, professional experience. They were shorter in duration, 3 months to a year. You didn't have to go through the long political language indoctrination that Peace Corps required for Peace Corps volunteers that went for 2 years. And they were older, more mature people, and they were put in more positions of responsibility within the governments that they were, of the countries they were going to. And so I was the first person they were going to ever put in a medical university for a new military medicine wing that was to open in August 2015. I thought, great, this sounds like something I would be good for. I was selected for it. There were only 2 of us, and the other person was a man who had been a Navy SEAL and then was in the Navy Special Warfare for, I think, 20 years. He was to go to the east. Most people know the east if they know a little about the Ukraine conflict as Donetsk, Lugansk, and those areas, and I was to go to the west. I was placed at Ternopil State Medical University. There was a big ceremony because this is the first time the Peace Corps ever had people doing this. I was the first person to do it in the West. He's the first in the East. We went for orientation and a kind of training in Kiev first, and this is in the summer of 2015. And then we each went our separate ways, but he and I kept in contact the whole time and have kept in contact after for a while. Again, this was supposed to be one kind of project, which was because I had successfully created a curriculum for the Yerevan State Medical University of training medical doctors, residents, students to go to international conferences using medical English diagnostics, being able to communicate medical theater or operating theater to theater, how to create research articles and research designs that would be accepted by the West. And then I added, because I'd had special training both through the Army and other PD programs in computer databases and information literacy, to introduce that to them as well. They didn't have any intranet in that university, and you had to go all over Ternopil to get the information and documentation. And so I partnered up with the IT guy in the biomedical department, and we created an intranet while I was there and did a number of other projects. But shortly after when I first got there, I was given a pretty cool reception. I mean, I understood why. I had the same in Siberia when I first went. Eastern Europeans are not notorious for being warm and welcoming like, let's say, Italians. So But then, as they got to know me more and we discussed more, I'm also a Chinese medical doctor, and post-trauma is one of my specialties, and they already had that problem, and I had already treated one of the doctors in Kiev successfully, and so she had said to some other people, this is something we ought to explore, Chinese medicine. At any rate, we were having a lot of discussions, and they started to know me, and I lived in the faculty dorms. I always usually live either with families or in the community. I don't live in an embassy compound. I don't live in a hotel, or, I mean, sometimes when I work with the military on base, but Peace Corps response, you live the same place they live, and you get the same salary they do, pretty much. So we did a lot of social things together too, and they started confiding in me that they didn't trust me because of some of the programs that had been offered to them, quote unquote, for free from the U.S. government, that they found to be worse than not delivering, actually did harm to them and their children. I'll mention two very specific ones I have first-hand knowledge of. One is a USAID, because also, again, USAID was in Ukraine, and they did a lot of programs in Ukraine in the time I was there, in 2015. And one area that people don't understand about influence operations, IOs, and what ends up being often disruptive operations in a country, or specifically what I witnessed both in Iraq and in Ukraine, was anti-Christian slant to their programs. I'll give you a small example.
Please.
There is a beautiful cathedral in Ternopil that opens up into one of the main parks there, so that when you go to a service there and walk out the door, it used to be, when I first went there, you open the doors after a service, and then you go outside and you see the beautiful trees in the park. It's very contemplative. USAID offered to buy big screens, supposedly to advertise sporting events and make more community available advertisements for people so that they would know if they didn't have internet, for example, that they would know what was going on when, in terms of calendar events. That seemed like a very good idea to the Chernobyl City Council people. Something for nothing, supposedly. And then the fine print was that USAID team would determine where those huge screens, and I mean huge screens, would go. They were the ones to decide. So the USAID team decided they would put it right outside the church. So instead of coming outside of the church and seeing a beautiful park, you came outside of the church, saw these advertisements, including the one I really remember was Amway, of all things. You come out of the church and see an Amway advertisement of American companies, of some sporting events, but it was definitely another propaganda influence operation in a kind of a subtle form people wouldn't think about. But it was deliberate. You could have put those screens in another place where people would have congregated, not right outside the beautiful cathedral. That really annoyed me. They also had Peace Corps, sort of the younger, maybe more naive, some of the Peace Corps volunteers work in anti-trafficking in the west of Ukraine. Before I go in terms of the medical university, so my colleagues there knew I was interested in research in certain areas, and then they started talking about the free vaccine program and the biolabs that they received money for. And over time, they showed me some documents and expressed their concerns that, and I talk about it more in depth in my book, Traveling Off the X, is that when they were under Russian influence, they never had these problems with the vaccines. First of all, they never had all these vaccines they were supposed to give their children. Children were healthier. But then they discovered in their research, when they started to investigate, I'll just put it that way, that these vaccines were deliberately infected with the AIDS virus. And there was a lot of media push for a while about AIDS in Ukraine, and it's because of sex trafficking, and blaming the Ukrainians essentially for the AIDS. And we determined and discussed that that was probably not the case. It was through these medical injections that they were getting it in children especially. And I only went to one biolab, and I didn't go, of course, into all the biolabs, just one particular lab, although I was shown the outside of another one in another city. I was in Lviv.
Mm-hmm.
They took me to Lviv, and I was outside one in Kiev. At that time, I thought maybe there were 3 or 4 biolabs that were funded by a combination of USAID, Bill Gates Foundation, a number of US politicians. You see, countries like Albania, Ukraine, even Romania, maybe not at the moment, but at that time, 10 years ago, they didn't have the same standards for research, what was considered conscionable research. They didn't have advise and consent, informed consent, like we have to do in the West. They can do all sorts of experiments on animals and people that you cannot do in most Western countries. So it was from that point of view, the kind of psychopathic point of view, it was a great place to have the 26 or 27 biolabs that they ended up finally exposing in the last couple of years and admitting to. And that's why my Ukrainian colleagues at first were very hesitant about the program I was representing and why I was really there. And I was horrified. I didn't want to believe that the U.S. government programs, U.S. government money, would do something so evil as use infected vaccines for children. But all I'll say is I became convinced, and I also saw what was called in those days a white paper. It's a position paper. I believe Victoria Nuland's name and John McCain's name was on it. A number of politicians' names. Wasn't able to copy that document, just read it and return it, which said that the agenda essentially for Ukraine from way back, since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, was essentially that Ukraine would remain a buffer against Russia, and that Ukraine, the very fertile land of Ukraine, most people don't realize that there was a genocide against Ukrainians called Holodomor, done by the Soviets. The Ukrainians know very well what the Soviets were and the Russians were capable of. They were starved to death. The Ukraine is the breadbasket of that part of the world with very fertile soil. And the Ukrainians, the position paper essentially said, we only want Ukrainians that are aligned with the U.S. We want Ukrainian land, but not the Ukrainians. I think if you understand how some people would take that position, you can understand why they don't care about sacrificing Ukrainians for foreign policy. And at the time, I was also taken to a camp that they had outside of Chernobyl when I first got there, in fact, because many of the medical residents, doctors, professors from eastern Ukraine that have been bombed out already. Most people don't know that there was a war going on between the west and the east of Ukraine for years before Maidan. And it was with essentially neo-Nazi or Nazi sympathetic in terms of their values, militias, weaponized by U.S. politicians, most prominently John McCain, it's been proven, and against their own people. So it was the West against the East, the denazification that is talked about had to be real. I was personally taken, I describe it in my book, to a Nazi rally in the West. It was a different kind of fear I experienced than being in Afghanistan. Thousands of people, and they had big screens burning the American flag, showing American symbols, and saluting, and yeah, it's so that's another part of the Ukrainian conflict that's not really talked about in the West.
Mm-hmm.
I had colleagues when I was working with the American University of Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan. They speak Russian, and some other colleagues in other countries that say, yes, it was not at all how it was portrayed in the West. It was much more complicated than that. So that was going on as well. I was in the West, so one of the main statues in one of the main parks in Ternopil is Stefan Bandura. Stefan Bandura was a Hitler supporter, responsible for the killing of many Jews and Roma, and I only found out later that some of my colleagues and their families were Bandera supporters. They were Azov and Privy Sector, those are the militias, Nazi militias. And so I was brought to this camp, and that's where I met people from the East, medical professionals from the East, because their universities and a lot of their hospitals had been bombed. And that's, between halting Russian and halting English and interpreters, that's when they told me, we don't want to fight brother against brother. It's other countries that want us to fight brother against brother. And there was also a military base there that, the U.S. was definitely sponsoring, giving money, giving equipment, giving arsenal, giving weapons, and even, you could say more important at this point, 2015, providing them with PSYOPs training, which is very effective. I think Oliver Stone also did a counter to that in one of his documentaries, Ukraine on Fire. So the goal at that point, just in that one base, outside of Ternopil, was training 250,000 Ukrainians. And that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Before Russia declared war.
Yeah.
Before. So this is what I mean about, these humanitarian programs are complicated. And there are a lot of other agendas, and there are earnest people that do work in there, and programs that sound very good and recruit people who really want to work there. But as many people have demonstrated, and Doge, I hope we'll get to more of it, and this article that just came out today, and Michael Benz and Whitney Webb and other people who are really respected and credible investigative reporters have documented by whistleblowers coming forward, and it's dangerous to come forward.
Yeah.
You're going to expose people getting that much money.
Yeah.
That it's 10% or less of all these trillions now of dollars over all the different countries over the decades actually get to the people in the programs they're supposed to, and most of it is our tax dollars.
And it's mostly by design. Yeah. Okay. That's wild. Tell me, I'll make a transition here. We talked before about child trafficking and some of the most prevalent times for children or women, to be exposed to, to be exposed to that would be during times of war, national disasters, weather incidents, things of that we spoke about last time. Do you see much of that in the Ukraine conflict?
Yes, and I've written a couple of Substack articles. People can also read for more details, not just my observation or my research. They can go by, there's a number of reports, often done outside of the U.S., by the way. Some of the best investigative reports are done from Eastern Europeans who speak and read and write fluent English, and by other investigative reporters outside of the NGOs. I will also, I think I might have emphasized this before, but once again, people get up in arms and they go, oh, but it's NGOs. Well, why should NGO stands for non-governmental organization.
Yeah.
Why should a non-governmental organization be receiving governmental money? If you're receiving governmental money, you must adhere to the protocols by that agency. So people who are moaning, especially, and I'll say it, whether it's the Catholic Church or Jewish Relief or LDS or these other church organizations that are crying now because they're not going to be getting this money through USAID and other foreign aid and humanitarian aid. Well, truly, in the first place, they shouldn't have been relying on government aid. Charity means you're giving of yourself, not other people's tax money, for a program or agenda you may not support at all. So child sex trafficking and child organ, blood, and adult, but mostly child organ blood trafficking has been done for quite a while, and I have it from very credible sources, from doctors I know from Syria and other countries who tried to report that both the United Nations agencies and what was called the White Hats were not the good guys. They were disappearing bodies and disappearing organs when they went to clear the battlefield. There are some people coming forward on that, but that's such a lucrative business. That makes so much money. I won't go into too much in adrenochrome because it's in one of the articles that I talk about, but the way it is harvested is horrible and cruel, and it requires people with absolutely psychopathic tendencies to be able to extract while somebody's in the midst of, especially children, in the midst of being absolutely tortured, so that the adrenaline goes into their blood at a certain point and concentrates the blood in a way that can make them get a high and energy they can't get from any other natural substance.
I had heard about that before, Joe, and one, I don't think I understand it, and two, I didn't think it was real. I had heard people say that, didn't think that had any credence. It seemed so outlandish to me that somebody would do that. So what, I'm not trying to pick you, I'm just saying, what can you give me in the listening audience, a crumb, a rabbit hole, something to go down where we can find credible information about that reporting?
I do list some of these reports in my second Substack article on Ukraine and trafficking. I can send you some links too. I think that there is enough now on open source on the web, and not the dark web or anything you have to go onto, but the regular internet. I would use a different search engine. I would use Brave or Gibaroo. Don't go on Google. And a lot of doctors are coming forward, but it's also a lot of, you have to be careful because there's a lot of quote-unquote celebrities and people that make it sound like it's sensationalistic. They do it on purpose to make it sound like, oh, it couldn't possibly be real, because probably they may have been indulging in it too. Rather than talk just about adrenochrome, though, I'd just talk about the organ harvesting, because people are very quick to talk about reports about what China has been doing with the Uyghurs and their organ harvesting. And 3 Canadians came out, I think, in the 1990s. They went on an exploratory investigation, and they were able to document it, and they brought it before a number of international bodies, and they were totally dismissed because it's a very lucrative business.
You know what's crazy is when you say that, I don't want to believe it. Just like I didn't want to believe Russiagate, just like I didn't want to believe the dozen other things that people told me were conspiracy theories with no weight to them. And then a few short years later, you find out there's all the weight, and that they weren't conspiracy theories, and that they really did have some credible reporting. So when I hear something that outlandish anymore, I got to go, well, I thought the other stuff was crazy too, that people told me I was a nutbag for believing or even entertaining, and all that came true. So it makes me feel like, you could tell me just about anything and I'd say, well, maybe.
Well, I won't do that. I mean, I believe I was the same. I didn't want to believe a lot of nefarious activities, especially what people would do to children, what doctors would do to children. No, I didn't want to believe it at first, but then when you realize through seeing not only the reports, but also, I'm not just talking about medical interventions, I'm talking about throwing acid on children. I've treated patients who had acid thrown on them. You wouldn't know because their handlers or the traffickers have done it, or the terrorists have done it below the neck, but you see it. And I know it's very difficult, and a lot of people, even in my family, early on, I think some of them now have come around, would go, that can't be, that you're exaggerating, that's not possible. No. I can say it, I don't care anymore if people don't believe it. There's also, if you know how to research, don't just go to Google and the first pages, go to credible reports. That's why I teach information literacy. I teach a whole course about it, and I talked about it extensively on Duran Kedar's podcast when I was on that one, about the importance of real literacy, how to find credible resources, because there is so much sensationalization, disinformation, people who really don't know and put out stuff.
I mean, I think that's one of the
the documents or the reports because either I wasn't allowed to copy them. I still do have non-disclosure agreements. I no longer have my security clearances as of next month, a year ago. So I don't have to worry about keeping my clearance. And I have had clearance for over different kinds of clearances over the last 20 years. But I also think that even when doctors come forward and try and tell people what's going on, I can think of Dr. Simone Gold, for example, who was put in prison for a while. It's very dangerous. Sometimes they'll lose their license because so many people don't want this information coming out. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking about what would people do for money? What would a well-educated doctor even do for money? And even though we're saying this seems crazy, they are giving males female hormones and chopping their body parts off and ushering it in for money over the last 8 years or so, just getting more prevalent because nobody said stop. Nobody's went and held them accountable. Nobody said you can't do this to kids. And they were doing it for money that way and ushering it through. And
Planned Parenthood selling fetal baby parts and baby parts. And not just providing for contraception. It's just, I understand most people don't want to look at the dark side of humanity until it's in their face. And even then, they don't want to. We just talked about this last time. But why I wanted to talk with you, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to do so, is this is a timely topic in terms of foreign aid and where our tax dollars are going to, how they cash the money into different sectors that you may not even know about that are never reported. Organ harvesting is not reported.
Sure.
Why do some of these big organizations that are supposedly, always for humanitarian aid, and started out that way, but they aren't that way, like Peace Corps Response, Peace Corps, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children. Oh, tangentially to the point you were making, yes, I worked with and was very good friends with, we've been roomed together for a while, who used to be the director of Save the Children for Southeast Asia, and that was during the tsunami of 2004. And other people who are kind of like predators, the vultures that go around after a natural disaster like that. And there will be children without parents and children without advocates, and that's a harvesting place. And tragically, a lot of these NGOs, non-for-profit supposedly, and by the way, Red Cross, Red Crescent are not non-for-profit, they are for-profit organizations. they don't have the money to maybe lure the best hires. So some of these quote-unquote doctors that work for them are not scrupulous people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even trained. Some of them have faked their medical certificates. And some of them are just like butchers. So they get into these organizations, they infiltrate them, and they carry on a side business with criminal networks, or in some cases even terrorist networks.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't think of, oh, a natural disaster area. Well, not everybody that runs into help, or to say, we'll take your child from, let's just say, Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world. We'll take them, and we promise, we'll educate them, and your daughter will come back, or your son will come back, this fine person to help your family. And they believe them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're essentially, and they'll even make a mark or sign that their child can go with them. But they're never going to see that child.
Yeah. Sickening. Well, I guess I got one last thing. Something that I think every American faces, especially myself, anybody that really wants to do like research, right? You want to look into people, you want to find credible people, and I feel like you've touched on that a couple of times. I don't understand it unless it's, clickbait, or if it's just people trying to, maybe they have a misguided view or an uneducated view of things, or maybe they don't care and they're just trying to get, popularity or sell, sell the information, whatever it is. But it seems to me that anymore, people are going to put a big tagline on an article or on a podcast or on a talking event about whatever is the hot button item right now. Regardless of whether they're an expert or not, they're going to put their 2 cents in and then put something big and bold that says USAID and then pass that off. And I think the danger in that is that the average American, not only American, the average, citizen of the world that wants to find information is left wondering the credibility of these people because it's an internet thing, right? I'm going to see them on TikTok. I'm going to see them on podcasts. I'm going to see them on YouTube. And then I have to hope that they've been vetted properly and that they're really an expert at what they're talking about. And I think sometimes what we have is we have these either, war journalists or photojournalists or, some of these people that maybe their heart was in the right place when they started and realized maybe that work is a bit harder, a bit more dangerous, a bit more intense, takes more effort than maybe what they realized. And so they maybe get the wave tops of an article or the wave tops of a situation and then pass that work as clickbait. And that being the case almost everywhere, it's hard for the average person to know, well, is that person who they say they are? How do I know if that's a credible source? And I see that a lot. So I just want to know your take on that. And then, like what you have to say about it, because you fall into the category of a journalist and of somebody that's trying to get transparent thought from experience out there. How do you view that when you see some of these non-experts giving expert opinion?
I don't see myself as a journalist rather than as a writer. And that's only recent. I mean, I've had to write technical writing, and I've been trained in doing technical writing, not only because in the Foreign Service School, especially when I went, it was very rigorous training. And each agency, DOS is different than USAID, is different than DOD in the way they want their briefings, their reports, their grant applications, their AARs done. And I've had to learn all those protocols. Somebody who hasn't learned those and then is just making a decision based on their opinion and observation, they're not credible.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is I only have become writing about this. As I said, I was born in 1953, and I've only started putting myself out about that partially because so many of my colleagues are dead now, and they would have done a better job in many ways, perhaps. And they were maybe younger and hotter and looked better on podcasts. I do feel it's important, especially because I love what's happening right now in terms of the push for transparency, for auditing, for accounting, for bringing forth the actual receipts and documents, for people who really want to know I always go to people who have the documents. I put links in my own articles for the reports that I've referred to. When I know who is sponsoring that report, for example, you don't want to go to a report by Nestle's company about the benefits of chocolate, or you don't want to go to Pfizer company about the safety of vaccines. You want to triangulate your sources and go to those who have done the actual research. And a lot of people can't read the technical research documents. Because I studied medicine, because I've worked in technical universities, also have my radio engineering license, I can read those and understand what they are. I understand for people, it's just like me reading forensic accounting. It just dizzies me. That's why my teammates will do that. Find what your skill is and read that part and go to somebody else who can interpret it. But don't go to a journalist for interpreting economic data unless that person is an economist as well.
Mm-hmm.
There are excellent economists, finance people. Catherine Austin Fitz, excellent, writes the Solari report. Go to those reports. Go to their talks. Go to, Robert Kennedy has his own television network, Children's Health Defense Fund. They also talk about some of these issues we're talking about in terms of children. Go to people whose legal expertise is in the area they're talking about, not just I'm a lawyer, or not just, it's just like military. Okay, this person's a soldier, and so you're going to take everything they say, even if they've never been in combat, or, I mean, you have to look at that person's history, who they were trained by, find some references for them. I mean, I have references from people that can give them and have given them online. I have also people that, if it's through the military intel community, of course they don't do it online. You'd have to call them and they will, they'll vouch for me. But I think, the clickbait and the virtue signaling is just out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people do it because they want to be looked at as I'm such a good person, and really it's because they want to get a lot of followers, or they want money from their YouTube channel, or they want to cover for what their real agenda was in going to a place. I have no sympathy for them, especially people who are vultures. They go around where there's pain, just for clicks, essentially. And they don't really care about the people there, and they're not going to live there. And I'm always very conscious of the places I live and the people I live with. First of all, for confidentiality, which is often absolutely a must. And the other is to be respectful of the fact that I'm a guest in their country, and I also represent to them who they may see as an American. And I learned the hard way early on in my career, not career, really life, in living and working and having family in the Gumbaynggirr Aboriginal Nation, and making a report to the Australian government on stolen generations way back in the 80s and early 90s. And I had somebody on, they were asked us to be on a radio program, and there was an American visiting journalist kind of person, and he started talking about some of the strategies we were using to get documents, and I couldn't believe he was talking about this on radio, because this was very confidential information. It could out the families who had helped us. It alerted those people who didn't want those documents to come out that we were going to go find them. I mean, so I've learned to be circumspect, and it's part of the reason why I haven't talked about this for decades. But now I think it's a different landscape in terms of investigative reporting. I was fortunate. I don't mention this because it just goes on too long, but right after Georgetown, I worked for Jack Anderson and Les Switten in investigative reporting. That was the real Washington Post under Ben Bradley in the days when they really went door to door, and I learned tactics and strategies and ethics from them. But most people now, they can just go online and, as they say, just vomit online, and somebody will lap it up. I think you do have to Most commercial media is just that. It's commercial. It's done for advertisers. It's done to make money. The people like, I really respect James O'Keefe and Project Veritas that he used to do. I really respect Whitney Webb. I really respect Catherine Austin Fitz in the Solari Report. I respect Children's Health Defense Fund. I respect Caroline Glick. I respect those who will do it even if they're not paid, even if they only reach 10 people. I know some people were pushing me to get on podcasts that had more people. I'd rather talk with you, Ryan, and even if we reach 5 people who it changes their mind a little, or they go look a little further, read a little further, that's fine. I've gone to events where it was supposed to be a couple of hundred people and maybe only 20 people showed up. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
If they're earnest there and they're willing to open their minds and listen, and maybe they even become advocates. I'm old enough now that some of the people that I taught decades ago or talked to decades ago are now doing very important and effective work in the world.
The ripple effect. Yeah.
I also don't actually, I worked as a personal assistant for Kurt Vonnegut and Jill Krementz and other people earlier on. I don't want to ever get that big. I mean, I think, it depends on your ambition. I'm satisfied that I contribute, even anonymously, to reports, just so long as I hope that the people that sometimes even died to get that information across, that information will be delivered to the right people.
Mm-hmm.
And, but for people who want to search online, as I say, don't use Google as your first source. Don't use Wikipedia. Go to the reports. Take the discipline. I ask people sometimes, how much time do you spend? I know I've done this sometimes. Just wasting time watching a series on Amazon Prime or Netflix or something like that. Well, don't do it tonight. Instead, read the actual report. Read the actual documents, and then see what you think.
Yeah.
And most documents that are credible will have links to their sources. I will mention Small Wars Journal because he was a Marine, David DeLegge, who started it. He died a couple of years ago. He was one of also my mentors, and he's the one who really encouraged me. He was a human person too, and he really encouraged me. Sometimes he would tell me, yeah, you're right, and this is very important, but we can't publish this. This is too incendiary right now, right? But right before he died, I didn't talk to him over the phone that time. It was email. I didn't realize how sick he was. It was an article I'd written about China after I'd gotten back from China, and he said, "You have to promise me you will keep writing." So that's why he and a few others, another Marine, Felix Arnold, they encouraged me and said, "You have this skill, you have this experience. Don't just keep it for yourself. That's actually selfish. If people don't want to believe you, that's their problem. But you've tried, and be diligent. The good thing about Army training as well is it was, bottom line up front, by the way, in State Department especially, you have to be very flowery. It's like it's something that could probably take 1 or 2 pages. You have to make it 20 or 30. USAID, you have to make it 10 or 15 pages, whereas, Army, you have to make it 1 or 2 PowerPoint slides. So I've learned over the years to change my writing. If I want to do my flowery, artistic expression, as I've done since I was 10 years old, I write a poetry book that people can discern in a different way. But I'm very careful and rigorous about quoting credible sources and about not putting in descriptions that, I don't always perhaps succeed, but people have given me positive feedback. I try not to put in any loaded descriptions, any adjectives that might sway people. I try to just stick with what has happened, where they can go to find out more, and what the consequences could, and also sometimes project what they might be. And I hope I continue that until I die, honestly, no matter where I am.
I think you will. I think you will. I enjoy your updates. I enjoy your Substack. Subscribe just today, but the articles that you sent me and then browsing through more articles is a wealth of information. Why don't you tell people where they can find your work online and about your books and some of your other work, because I know that the people that are listening now are going to want to come find some more about you. So I know you have the Substack. I know you have a poetry book and then a couple of novels.
Free, by the way. I mean, of course, I love it when people, a couple of people have donated like what would be, even a cup of coffee a month. That's great.
Yeah.
But you don't have to. You can get it for free. I'm on Amazon. I have my website, JoPattix, JoPattix.com, which lists my link tree, which has all my social media. I'll say this, in terms of my writing, I'll always keep updated on social media, but as of the next month or so, I'm gonna go off listing any sort of personal stuff. I've had some serious situations happen to me in the last couple of weeks that I just don't think that that's a good idea. But in terms of finding my writing, or maybe where I'll be speaking, and to advertise platforms like yours and Donon's and other people's, yes, I'll post those. I do have an Instagram I will keep, and I do have a YouTube channel and LinkedIn.
Gotcha. All right, guys, that's where you can find Joe, JoPattix.com, JoPattix.com. Follow that link tree. You'll see her Substack, her Instagram, her LinkedIn. And I hope you do. I hope you dive in as an audience, because we're in an era where things don't feel sure, and we're in an era where we're going to come out of some decades-long abuse, fraud, waste, and I know we're probably a lot of people taglines sick of hearing that, but it's something that Americans need to pay attention to, because we've been funding these programs, many of us, since we've been alive. These programs have been funded by our tax dollars, and as far as me personally, I'm not thriving, but I'm focusing on transparency in any conversation that I have, especially on my platform with people like Joe, because there's been enough time with lies. There's been enough fibs. There's been enough direct assault on honesty from our government, from some of our agencies that we fund. And for me, it's about the people. Since I signed an oath to join the Marines, it's been about protecting the Constitution and the people of this country. And that's what I will continue to do. I just feel like right now it's time to air it out. We got to air it out. We got to restructure. And are some of these dollars necessary to keep a thriving nation and a unilateral superpower? Yeah, probably they are. And if we're not doing them, other countries are going to keep doing them. And if we don't keep doing some of these things, we lose a little bit of footing. And I get that. But this other billions and billions, possibly trillions of dollars that we're footing shouldn't be going to our enemies. I don't think the American people like that. They shouldn't be going to evil entities and evil nefarious actors. Even I don't even know if evil is the right word for some of it. It seems like there should be a more powerful word of things that we've talked about tonight. So from me to you, know that that's what I'm trying to bring, and I will always be open, objective. I will be honest and transparent, and I will bring guests onto my show that will give you their honest and transparent look at the topics at hand. So, Joe, again, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate your transparency. I appreciate your willingness to sit, for a couple of hours and talk with some guy like me, some nobody that just has questions. So I appreciate that. And guys, again, if you didn't watch episode 83, go back and check out Joe's life. Episode 83, maybe one of the most resilient guests I've ever had on the podcast, with some of the situations in her life. So episode 83, Joe Munisteri, and we're going to close it out right there. I appreciate it, Joe. I appreciate you guys for coming on. Make sure you like, subscribe, and all of the things on whatever platform you're following on, and definitely drop us a note about what you think about the podcast, questions, concerns.
comments, and you know, I'll make sure those go to the right place, and we try to get an answer out there to you. For Choices Not Chances, Brian, signing off.